Well, welcome everyone to today's course. We're going to be talking about how do I know a child is ready for power mobility. My name is Michelle Lange. I'm an occupational therapist in the Denver, Colorado area, and I have the privilege of working in this area of assistive technology, including power mobility, and I primarily work with children. This is a real common question. We might think, all right, here's a child I'm working with, and maybe they're going to use a power chair or other power mobility device sometime in their future, but how do I know? How do I know if they're really ready, if I'm ready to refer them perhaps for an evaluation? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to talk about determining readiness. Is this person ready for a power chair, or at least for that power wheelchair evaluation? Part of our goal of determining if someone's ready is if we feel this child is not quite ready, we don't just give up and wait a few years and try again. There's actually quite a bit we can do to help someone become ready for that power wheelchair in the future. But with determining readiness, we're trying to prepare this little person for that power wheelchair evaluation, whether we're performing the evaluation ourselves or whether we are referring for that evaluation to another team. When a power wheelchair is recommended for a client, there's a number of features that have to be considered. We have to keep in mind the driving method. That's a big one. How is this person going to use the power wheelchair? How are they going to control it? Because many times people cannot successfully use a joystick. Fortunately, there's a lot of other ways of driving. The seating system is critical. If someone's not positioned well, they're not going to be able to use their body well. And often I start an assistive technology evaluation with seating because until I have that little person positioned well, they just can't show me what they can do. The drive wheel configuration of the power chair is also important because these power chairs come in rear, front, and mid-wheel drive, and they each perform a little differently. Some of them are a little more intuitive to use. Some of those configurations work a little better with alternative driving methods, something other than a joystick. And then finally, power seating. Even children can often benefit from power seating, such as a power tilt system or power seat elevate, to help them be as functional as possible in their mobility. So there's a lot that happens in that power wheelchair evaluation. And again, there's some things we can do ahead of time to see if we think the child is ready. So prior to looking at all of these considerations, what power wheelchair base do we get? What kind of seating? Do we put power tilt on there or not? First, we can look at if the client is ready from a motor standpoint and a cognitive standpoint. From the motor standpoint, can the client use a power wheelchair driving method? Again, there's a number of them. Do they have the required motor skills to use one of those available methods to help them to drive? Cognitively, it's important that the client understand mobility concepts that are required to use a power wheelchair, and we're going to go through those concepts. And this applies primarily to first-time drivers. Someone who hasn't used a power chair before may not have had any successful independent mobility at all. For typical children, their first mobility is crawling, and that begins to develop mobility concepts. But for a child who perhaps has never been able to move themselves around on the floor, in a manual chair, in a gait trainer, that child may have very underdeveloped mobility concepts simply because of lack of experience. And so it's important to assess this and sometimes train this so that kids can be successful. What if the client isn't ready yet? Well, there's a lot of people who are concerned about any criteria that may limit the provision of mobility. So there are a few tests out there, little assessment tools to determine, is this person ready for a power chair? And there are people who are rightfully concerned that, well, if my child doesn't pass this test, they don't get a power chair. But what if they're really ready? Maybe we shouldn't have any criteria at all. We need to give everyone a shot. Well, I'm all for let's give everyone a shot, but my goal is successful mobility. I don't want this power chair to become a coat rack in the garage. Our outcome is successful use. So if we determine that a client is not quite ready for a power chair, we think if we provide one right now, they will not be successful, then we step in and develop the skills that they need. And sometimes that doesn't take very long. And we're going to address that in our next webinar. So today's webinar is not about excluding provision of a power wheelchair. It's about doing everything we can to help this person be successful. So is this a big deal? Is this something we need to be worried about? Absolutely. There's a lot of research, fortunately a lot of very recent research in the last 5-7 years, that clearly indicates that early independent mobility, whether it be crawling, whether it be I can push a manual chair or move in a gait trainer, or I can use a power mobility device, any independent mobility increases cognitive skills, psychosocial skills, vision and visual perceptual skills. We had a recent webinar with ABLENet that's in the University of recorded webinars on the ABLENet site, where we discussed just what does the research say? What's the very, very latest? So that you can refer to that to help you direct how you interact with clients when you introduce early mobility, but also to help with funding, because funding sources who might otherwise not be real happy with some of our recommendations, if we can say, look, the research does support this intervention, that can be very helpful. One of the ways you can back this up, besides the information that's provided in that webinar, is the Resnick position paper on pediatric mobility. This has been recently updated, and it's available on the Resnick website. Sometimes it's a little hard to find this particular document or any of the position papers on the Resnick website. For this reason, I have also placed them on, let me get this arrow here, on my website, atilange.com, and you can find under resources all of the Resnick position papers. RESNA, if you're not familiar, is the Rehabilitation, Engineering, and Assistive Technology Society of North America. It's an assistive technology professional association. There's a number of special interest groups within RESNA, and one of them is all about wheelchair seating and mobility. And they have been cranking out a number of position papers over the last probably 10 years now. So these position papers are a compilation of expert opinion. The people who put these together and write them are all actually working in this area and often doing research in the area. It also includes a very comprehensive listing of the available research. And again, like I said, it is recently updated because some of that information was outdated, both in terms of literature, but also the clinical implications of that research. So all of that has been updated. So we're working with some kids. We know they don't have the mobility they need to have, and we're convinced perhaps that there are huge developmental benefits to provision of early mobility. We're kind of ready to move forward, but there might still be some barriers. A common barrier that you might be running into is that someone on the team wants to hold off on exploring power mobility for this child. There may be concerns about motor development. If this child gets a power chair, they'll never be ambulatory, they'll never walk. There might be concerns that if the child can use other mobility, if we just wait a little longer, if I just have a little more time in therapy, I can get this child walking or using that gait trainer or pushing that manual chair. And then finally, there's always concerns about funding. So I have heard from a number of various team members, including caregivers, if this child gets a power chair, they'll never walk, or they won't use their other mobility equipment, or they'll get lazy. I haven't had someone recently tell me they might gain weight. Well, getting a power chair is certainly no guarantee of gaining weight, and not getting a power chair is not an effective diet plan. Fortunately, there is research that shows us that kids who use a power wheelchair are actually more likely to attempt any other form of mobility. So instead of getting lazy, we might find that when this child is not in their power chair, they're more willing to attempt other things. I think a lot of this is actually fairly intuitive. So you've got a child who on the floor perhaps has no mobility at all, and they see something that's out of reach. Chances are they're not going to be very persistent in trying to get that object because, well, they've never been able to get it before. But if that same child had a power wheelchair evaluation last week and they were able to move themselves towards desired objects, now they see themselves as more capable. They've done it before. And what I often see in my clients is then once they have a taste of that power mobility, when they're not in the power chair, they're much more persistent in trying to move because they know they've done it before. They get addicted to movement no matter what the form of movement is. What about that second barrier? Just give me some more time. I need to do some more therapy. It's very important to remember that a power wheelchair is not a failure of therapy. It doesn't mean, darn, if I just tried harder, my client would have been successful. They would be walking or using other mobility techniques. I guess I have to give up and give in to the power wheelchair. A power wheelchair is just another tool. Our goal isn't get a power chair. Our goal is provide independent mobility. A power wheelchair is a tool in our toolbox, along with crutches and gait trainers and other mobility strategies. It's just another tool. Now, there's a lot of conceptions tied to it, and families certainly have a lot of difficulty at times accepting a power chair. It's important to keep reminding team members our goal is mobility, however we can get to it. And there's certainly a hierarchy there, but some of our clients will require power mobility in order to achieve that independent mobility. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about funding. No one will fund a power chair for this child. They're too young, the school has no money, whatever the concerns might be. However, fortunately, funding is not as hard as a lot of people think. With a comprehensive evaluation and proper documentation, it is often very possible to get power mobility devices for very young children. It does need to be well documented, and I'd be happy to share more information with you on that. It's important to work with the supplier on this because the suppliers are submitting for funding for this equipment all the time. And so they have a really good handle on what information needs to be included for successful funding of equipment. So for example, if Brady is being considered for a power wheelchair and has Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance, the supplier may be able to let me know that Blue Cross Blue Shield is very interested in how a power wheelchair will remedy functional concerns, and maybe they're not so concerned about medical. So instead of me spending a lot of time in my documentation explaining that Brady has cerebral palsy and as a result has difficulty with motor control and this will help compensate for his lack of motor control, they may be more interested in how this will make a difference in Brady's life. Like now Brady can drive from his classroom to the cafeteria independently. So it's important to know what those funding considerations are. Another consideration when it comes to the supplier that's important to keep in mind is power wheelchairs, specifically pediatric power wheelchairs, require a supplier who specializes in complex rehabilitation equipment, sometimes called complex rehabilitation technology or CRT. So this supplier will most likely have a credential called an ATP, an assistive technology professional, and will work for a company who specializes in CRT. If they do not, they really shouldn't be recommending and working with pediatric power chairs. So it's important to make sure you're working with the appropriate supplier on this. Okay, so let's say, again, you have a student, you think they could use a power chair. How do you determine they're ready for that evaluation? It can be a little intimidating to say, go get this evaluation, if you're not too confident that this child will be successful. Well, there are some strategies we could use to determine motor and cognitive readiness. Let's start with motor readiness. Now, the most common driving method for a power chair is a joystick, though, like I said, there's many different driving methods. And there are some recorded webinars within the ABLEnet library on alternative driving methods if you are interested in that information. And who wouldn't be? I love this stuff. Actually, there's quite an amazing variety of alternative driving methods out there. And if the motor skills of a client are really the only barrier, boy, you should be able to find something, or that evaluation team should be able to find something that will help them drive, because we have such an amazing variety of options. Well, let's say we're going to start with a joystick. Can the student access the joystick? Well, to use a joystick, the client needs to be able to reach out and grasp the handle. Get that arrow again. And then the client needs to be able to push the joystick in the direction of movement they want to move. The challenge is, and an advantage of a joystick, is we have 360 degrees of control. So the positive side of that is I have lots and lots of options for where I want to drive. The downside for a new driver is if I don't push directly forward, I'm going to start kind of veering to the side and may not understand why. I need to be able to hold it in a precise direction to move the chair there. I also need to be able to let go quickly and consistently, because that's how I'm going to stop. Now, a child doesn't have to drive perfectly when I first try a chair. We're looking for potential, not mastery. But this is a skill that's going to be required. Key for a lot of our clients who have abnormal muscle tone, like clients with cerebral palsy or traumatic brain injury, is that joystick use requires grading of the force and distance of movement. Well, what does that mean? If I can't grade the distance of my movement, I might overshoot this handle or undershoot it and have a hard time accurately grabbing onto it. If I can't grade the force of my movement, I might push too hard. So I'm cruising along forward, but it's really hard to make a turn because I need to back off to make that turn. Grading requires me to balance muscle groups, flexors and extensors, like the ones in my forearm, and people with abnormal muscle tone have a hard time doing that. If the client cannot use a joystick effectively, then we can assess whether they can use switches. There are a lot of different types of switches out there, and again, there's some recorded webinars on this topic. So there's mechanical and electrical switches that are available and can be combined and placed at whatever switch sites this client has volitional control. You can combine these switches for forward, left, and right control. So ideally, we're looking for 3 switches. The client doesn't need to back up right away. Matter of fact, that can be a problem for a lot of new drivers. So we want to start with at least 3 switch sites if we can. If we play around with some of this, we have a better idea of whether the client could be potentially successful with a power wheelchair. It is possible to drive with only 1 or 2 switches, but we want to develop the ability, if possible, to use 3 switches, because that's going to optimize future driving. We're going to make those forward, left, and right, and then reverse. That 4th switch site can wait at this early point in the process. For some clients, that 4th switch will become something called reset instead of reverse. Reset, which is also sometimes called a mode switch, changes the mode of operation of a power wheelchair. So typically, we turn on a power wheelchair. We're in driving mode. We move that joystick, we press those switches, we're moving the chair. But if we press that mode switch, we're placing the chair in a different mode of operation, such as a mode where I can control my power seating, such as a power tilt, or a mode where I can use one of those switches to control my communication device. So eventually, this child may need that switch. Chances are, early on in the process, we don't need to worry about that one quite yet. All right, I want to stop for a second and just see if people have any questions. As we go through this information, feel free to type in any questions or comments you have. It's absolutely fine. I'd love to make this as interactive as possible. We can really learn from each other. If I don't answer your question right away, it's because I know that answer is coming up in the presentation, or I will get it as soon as I stop to take a breath. So again, feel free to put those in at any time. We'll also have time at the end. If you're typing, keep typing. So first, we want to determine if the client is ready from a motor standpoint in terms of their ability to use a joystick or switches. Second, and probably more difficult, is determining if this client is ready from a cognitive standpoint, and that is determining if they have certain mobility concepts. One of your handouts is a criteria handout. Again, this is not designed to exclude anyone from receiving a power chair who should receive one. It's just a simple tool that I still use. I attach it to the back of my reports. I don't have to type as much of the same information, but I'm looking at specific mobility concepts that a client needs to have to use a power wheelchair successfully. I'm not looking for mastery on these. I'm looking for potential. And if I see that the client is struggling on one of these concepts, that's where I know I need to intervene with mobility training and then try again. So let's take a look at each of these, and we'll have some videos that should be helpful in demonstrating these as well. So first is cause and effect. And some people might disagree with me, but this is what I think is the primary mobility concept that someone absolutely has to have before they can successfully use a power chair. And this is realizing that when I move that joystick or when I press that switch, that the chair moves, that I'm causing that. And I sometimes work with clients who really are not understanding that that's happening. And without that basic cause and effect, the client really is not going to be able to successfully use a chair. We can work on cause and effect and try again. This can be measured by verbal response, but often by a nonverbal expression on the client's face. It's pretty obvious that they realize, wow, I'm moving. This is great. Just a baby step above cause and effect is stop and go. And this is really a more differentiated cause and effect. It's realizing that when I activate the driving method, I move the chair. When I release the driving method, the chair stops. So I have two different causes, two different effects. For some clients, they'll show both of these together. Great. But occasionally we have to break this down into more of a baby step to train it. So how do I measure this? Well, verbal response, whether the client's attempting to follow directions to stop and go, or if they're stopping for obstacles. Again, accuracy is not required at this point. I'm only trying to get an idea if this person is understanding the concept of stop and go. So we're going to watch a video here. And in this video, Brett, who's about 3, just turned 3, is beginning to realize that pressing a switch moves the wheelchair. But he's not showing stop and go yet. What you'll see in this video as well is a favorite strategy of mine. There's a lot we can do without actually having a power wheelchair available, especially in these early stages of exploring power mobility. So what I've done is I'm visiting Brett where he gets therapy. He's in his manual wheelchair and seating system, so he's well positioned. And I've placed a switch on his tray. I've been working with Brett for a little bit already on his positioning and accessing a communication device. And I know he can use a switch by his hand. I've explained to him that when he pushes that switch, I'm going to move the chair. I have not given him a lot of other direction because he's only 3. With children, I give very minimal instruction and I wait. So there'll be a lot of empty space in this video where it doesn't look like anything's happening, but I'm allowing Brett some processing time. And you'll see that he leaves a lot at the beginning and then he more quickly catches on. There's a little too much noise going on from Mom. I've encouraged her and the PT who's recording this to please try to be quiet so Brett has a chance to process what he needs to do. So with all that preface, let's look at the video.
If you want to make the chair go, push your switch.
Brett, come see Mama. I'm over here. Push the button, make it go. Over here.
You might need a little processing time.
Brett, I'm over here. Can you come see Mama? You're looking at the switch.
Good
Nice
job.
looking. Can you push the switch and make it go? Make it go to come see Mama.
Where's Mom? Want to drive him on?
Yeah?
Let's push the switch and drive him on. There you go.
Yay!
Okay. Yay! Hold it down again.
Come see Mama. Yay!
Yay!
Gonna push it again.
Push the button. Push the switch.
Again. There
Yay!
Stop.
All right, so you can see in that video there that Brett at first did not seem to respond when I directed him to hit the switch, but he was thinking about it. And he eventually looked at me, I think indicating I could use some help. I reinforced the directions. He then thought about some more, probably accidentally hit the switch, but still had the effect. Chair moved. The next time he hit the switch more readily, and again, more so the 3rd time. Did he stop in time? No. I think he's too excited with, hey, I'm moving. But he's showing us that cause and effect. And he continued practicing after that in therapy. The next concept that we need to look at is directional concepts. And this is the child realizing that the power wheelchair will move in different directions depending on how the access method is used. So with the joystick, understanding that depending on where I move the joystick, the chair goes in a different direction. Or depending on which switch I activate, the chair will move in a different direction. Do they need to get to a specific direction accurately? No. We're just looking at the concept at this point. So again, for a measure, we can see if the client responds verbally or non-verbally to different movement caused by different input. Or perhaps they're attempting to move to a location using different directional commands. All of that showing us they're starting to understand this concept. Judgment is tricky. It's hard to train, and it can be hard to measure. And in a child like Brett has had very little opportunity in his life to develop judgment. I'm a firm believer that we develop judgment primarily by experience. So if I'm racing around the playground and I run into my friend and we clunk heads, that hurts. And I learned that I need to be a little more careful because I don't want to hurt my head again. When Brett's stroller or wheelchair runs into someone, the wheelchair takes the hit, not Brett. And he sees someone say, ow, and jumping up and down, and he thinks it's hilarious. Many of our clients laugh when somebody is hurt around them because they can't understand what's happened. So I think that judgment sometimes doesn't develop very well until a client actually has an opportunity to use power mobility and move themselves around. But some things we could look for is the client might recognize an obstacle and attempt to avoid it, even if unsuccessfully. You might see a client turning their head away, closing their eyes. At least they're recognizing an issue. I can watch and make sure the client isn't overtly aggressive, or see if there's any way, shape, or form that this client is demonstrating some caution. Where I notice more of an issue for a lot of clients is when we come to problem solving. Problem solving is really very difficult, and when you really break it down, you can see how difficult it is for some of these very young children to drive. Problem solving means that I can figure out which direction I need to move the joystick and for how long I need to hold it in that direction, and then combine it with other directions that are also timed to get from point A to point B. If I'm using switches, I have to decide which switch do I hit, how long do I hold it down, and then which switch do I hit again to get from point A to point B. So that all requires quite a bit of problem solving, and you can see where the client would already need to have firmly established cause and effect and stop and go, as well as directional concepts. So how do we measure this? Well, the client may attempt to maneuver the power chair to a designated designation. And even if they take the long way, sometimes really the scenic route, every time they're hitting that switch or moving the joystick, they're learning. And that's a good thing. But we can see if the client seems to be starting to develop this problem-solving ability. I do encourage the children I work with that it's important that they follow directions. This is hard because often I have a client like Brett who's so excited that he really doesn't care what my directions may be. He just wants to move. But I do try to encourage them to listen to others around them, because those people might notice something, an obstacle, a hazard that the client can't see. It's not uncommon for anyone using a power chair to have a number of blind spots. They just simply may not be able to see a lot of areas around them. So they need to rely on other people to say, oh, stop, you're about to run into that, or run off that curve. An example I'll sometimes use with caregivers, and sometimes with my clients if it makes sense to them, is you or I in an automobile. If you're driving the car and I'm your passenger and we're having a lovely conversation about something, and all of a sudden I say, stop, hopefully you'll stop, because you're going to assume that I saw something that you didn't, even if you're a good driver. And so it is important to listen to other people around us. Motivation. Now, fortunately, when working with young children, motivation is not usually hard to find. Most kids are very motivated by movement, which is great. But it is a reason why we need to look at power mobility early. There are studies that show that dreaded learned helplessness, that passive tendency, can develop as young as 4 years of age, which means we need to get in there before perhaps this little person is not so motivated by the task. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to pop those in the chat box. Comments are fine as well. If you're typing, keep typing. Now, as I mentioned before, one of my favorite strategies, and we saw this in the video with Brett, is to start with a client's manual chair. It's less intimidating for the client and their caregivers. If they're already well seated, then that's great. I can take advantage of their positioning. I don't have to get a hold of a power wheelchair. I don't have to worry about, oops, they've just smashed into that wall, because it's all within my control and I can use their dependent mobility base. So we can use the strategies that we already discussed in screening a child to determine if they're ready for that power wheelchair evaluation, gather more information about that readiness, and pass it along to the evaluation team, whether we're a part of that team or not. So I place the child in their current dependent mobility base. So we saw this with Brett a few minutes ago. I make sure they're well positioned and determine a good switch site. Well, how do we choose the best switch site? Again, I would refer you to some previously recorded AbleNet webinars on just that topic. Then I place the most appropriate switch in that location, which of course brings up, how do I choose the very best switch? Well, we have a webinar for that too. So we have a webinar for everything at AbleNet. It's awesome. I explain what I'm going to do to the client, and I stay insanely calm and positive. If I get really revved up and really nervous and I get worried and they might crash into something, that kid is going to pick up on that, and they're going to get agitated as well. I need them to feel safe, to know that I won't let them hurt themselves, hurt anyone else, hit the walls. Everything's going to be okay. I'm behind them or on the side of them. I will take care of everything. So I need to stay very calm. Then when the child activates the switch, push the mobility base. I start with forward. So the child touches the switch, I move it forward. I'm not real precise on this sometimes because I want them to understand. So if that client is close to the switch but not quite there, I might reach out and help them out and move the chair right away so they have that reinforcement. If they barely touch the switch, I'll move it for a couple feet because I want them to know, hey, you got this switch, especially early on. As the child starts being more successful with forward, I'm stopping, I'm moving forward, I'm stopping, then I'll add a second switch. And something that I often use is what you see here. Let me get the arrow again. Just have a simple jelly bean switch here. I use different colors for different directions so everyone's clear. And then I use these universal switch mounts, usually with the friction knob. Oh, there it is, friction knob. That's available from AbleNet as well. I often have 3 of these set up, and I place a second switch wherever the client can control a switch in that direction. And when they hit that switch, I turn the chair. So now they have turn and they have forward. As that client's ready, I add a second turn, and before you know it, I have a little person who's driving, quote, with 3 switches on their manual chair. It works pretty well, and it can help me determine where to put the switches and what type of switches perhaps to use when we're ready for that evaluation. So you can now inform the evaluation team that you have a pretty good idea that the child can drive a power chair and where the driving method needs to be. So what we're going to look at next is a series of videos with my little friend Colton. So I'll get my arrow again. Maybe not. This is Colton, and I'm pushing his wheelchair. On the floor is his little brother Charlie, and ahead of him is his twin brother Jack. And they are distracting him a bit, but also being very motivating at the time. And you can see there's a jelly bean switch placed by his left cheek. When he pushes the switch, I'm moving the chair. Now, I have already been seeing Colton for a while at this point. He is 3 right now, and he is well positioned. He now has a manual chair, and he's starting to use a communication device. He's doing very well with the switch to the communication device, and so now we're branching out to mobility. So let's look at each of these videos.
Let's go. There you go.
Good job.
Let's do it again.
Well, yeah.
Wow, now what do we do?
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to help you for a minute. We're going to hold it. It's different than what you do talking.
So in this video here, we're just trying one switch for the first time. He is used to hitting a switch in this location, but he's also used to using it for a communication device. So he hits the switch momentarily, starts a scan. When the desired vocabulary is displayed, he hits the switch again. This time he's having to hold the switch down. So we've given him some time to practice with the communication device so that skill is nice and firm, and now we're trying to see if he could use the switch in a different way to use the power chair. which means he has to hold the switch down, a very different motor pattern. So far, he's doing pretty good. He understands the cause and effect. He's starting to show stop and go. I was just giving him a little bit of a hand to reinforce his learning. Let's look at our second video.
Moved. Hold it down. There you go. Your ear's kind of stuck on it, huh? There you go. Stop.
So he's getting a little better now at rolling off of the switch to stop. He's doing a really good job of sustaining contact to move down the hallway. He feels nice and safe because I'm moving the chair nice and slow. And if he was to head towards an obstacle, he knows he's not going to hurt someone or hurt the wall. I will let the chair bump into the wall because I want the client to know, oh, this is where I need to stop. But I don't slam it into the wall. And certainly do not allow the client to be injured or hurt in any way. Let's watch our third video.
Try again.
Good job.
Good job. You stop.
Now here, Colton's trying to drive again, but he's trying to grab the switch with his hand. Colton is starting to use his hands a little more. He doesn't have quite enough control to use his hands for driving yet, but he wants to feel that switch. He wants to check it out, and that's okay. And I still am taking that as, hey, you're hitting the switch, we're moving. So we've gone ahead and look, I think we might have some duplicate videos here. Let me see. We saw this slide. Let me move to the next one and see if this is a different video than we've watched before.
Come see Mom. There you go. He's so used to hitting that switch and letting go, it's going to take some practice to hold it down. But he sure knows what he's doing.
All right, come here, sweetie. Come to Mama.
Good job. You were listening. Look at you holding down that switch. A little more. You're touching it. Just give it a little push. There you go.
Good. So he's thinking, processing, coming on and off the switch, still practicing forward. A quick aside, one of the things that I do is I will sometimes plug a switch like this into a switch tester. And you can purchase these actually from ABDA. And I'll often mount the switch testers to the back of the chair. That way, if I have multiple switches going, I can tell for sure the client's activated a switch. Sometimes it's a little hard to tell if they're fully on or off of the switch. In this last video, you'll see we've added a second switch for turns and how Colton interacts with that. And this is all within the space of one appointment.
Look at your brother. Oh, we ran into the wall. That's okay. Let's try again. Should we go straight?
Oh, where we are.
Oh, look what.
Go get the balls. I'm going to go get the talker. And I think I should close the vents. It's cold.
If you touch this, it's going to be a trap door.
Oh my.
Come to the trap door, T. And I'll lift you up. Ready? Whoa! Come get it. You want to come draw? Oh, you're so sad.
There you go. Good job.
You don't need to throw it at him.
So there's a lot going on here. There's Mom, there's the speech therapist, Jill Coleman, who I work with quite a bit, both of his brothers. Lots of people going on, and actually after this, Colton about fell apart. His stomach was bothering him. His mom took care of his stomach, and he promptly fell asleep. So sometimes these things happen when we're working with little kiddos, and so we needed to stop, and we met again another day. The next time we met was actually out at the suppliers with a power chair, and Colton was able to drive that power chair with 3 switches. We have not recommended a power chair for him only because the entire time Colton was driving with 3 switches by his head. he had his hand on the joystick. The chair was not hooked up. It wasn't programmed to respond to joystick movement, but we were watching his hand, and he was moving his hand mostly in the right direction. Like I said, his fine motor skills continue to improve. I don't think he has quite enough motor control to use a joystick, but before we recommend a chair, we want to get together one more time, which we are doing in the near future, and have him try that joystick out. There's a new alternative that we can play with a little bit as well. This is from Stealth Products. They have a line of driving methods that fall under their iDrive line of products. Any of their iDrive driving methods can hook into, let's see if I get my arrow here, there we go, into a battery pack. This battery pack runs the driving method so that you can place this on their manual wheelchair, and when you can use it with a program such as a game they have called Loons. It's kind of like balloons, excuse me. So it's Loonz, and it's a free app you can download on a tablet, for example. You can hook up the iDrive method on their manual chair and let them play with this game through the driving method. And you could also, when the child activates the driving method, just simply move the chair manually if you wish as well. All right, so I'm going to stop the questions again. I know I've been talking a lot, so feel free to, again, put any questions in there or any comments, and we can have a conversation about that. While people are typing those in, I want to go over a take-home message. This is a lot of information. It's always nice to kind of sum it up. It's important to remember that some kids will hop in a power chair and start driving immediately. Yay, pick out colors. You don't always have to go through breaking down these mobility concepts into all of these baby steps. But other children need time and training to develop the skills that are required prior to that power wheelchair assessment so they can be successful. And it can be worth that time and effort, even though I can be a very impatient person, if in the end my client is successful with this chair rather than never getting one or never using one that is obtained. There are a lot of strategies that can be used to determine if a child's ready to look at a power wheelchair. And if they're not quite ready, there's a lot of strategies to develop that readiness. And again, we'll be talking about that next time. So speaking of next time, how do I develop readiness for power mobility, also known as pre-mobility training? That's going to be on September 17th. And how do I train a child who has a power wheelchair to be a better driver? We're going to talk about that, mobility training, on November 19th. You'll find some resources on my website, including the indoor power mobility criteria. That's one of your handouts from today. And again, you're welcome to use that in your job. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's course. I know everyone's really busy, and I appreciate you taking the time out to learn more about this important topic. And I truly hope that's helpful to you and to the clients that you serve. I want to make sure you have my contact information as well. And I know AbleNet wants to thank you very much for attending as well. And there is their contact information as well as social media.